Okay, folks, I think we are going to get started here. Welcome, everyone. I'm Tim Erlin. I'm head of product for WallArm, and I am joined by Tim Ebers, our field CTO, who is going to help me talk about safeguarding against account takeover incidents. We're really excited about this webinar and this topic. We think it's pretty interesting, and we hope that you do as well. So as we get started, we wanted to start with just a little bit of a poll here for the audience, a little audience participation. We'd love to know if you have experienced an account takeover attack. Now we're broadcasting this in two forums. So on Zoom, there's actually a Zoom poll if that's where you are, and if you're on LinkedIn, you can respond to this poll in the comment with one of those emojis. So those are the emojis that you can hopefully find in the LinkedIn comments. And while folks take a moment to respond to that poll about account takeover attacks, a couple of housekeeping items. As I mentioned, we're doing this on both Zoom and LinkedIn simultaneously, and we will be recording it, so it will be available after the fact. On LinkedIn, that's super easy because the event just gets archived, and you can watch it again at any time that you would like. And with that, I will say, first of all, thank you, Tim, for joining me for this conversation. I'm excited to talk with you about this topic.
No, I'm excited as well. Account takeovers are one of those things from my operational past that I've spent lots and lots of time working on. So it's exciting to talk about them and helping educate the organizations out there on what they're up against and then how to help protect themselves. And there's really, as we'll talk about in the discussion, there's really no one solution for this, right? This is a layered approach to how you have to think about security.
Yeah. And you said that this is something you've talked a lot about in your past as an operator. There's clear evidence in the data that's available that this is a huge problem for information security practitioners, for operators out there. So these are some numbers from last year, from 2023, pulled from the Verizon DBIR, Digital Shadows, Okta, and the IBM cost of a data breach. So a couple of different sources here. So first of all, 49% of breaches used stolen credentials. That's a huge number, actually. That's almost 50%, almost a majority of the breaches that occurred in 2023 involved the use of stolen credentials. 80% of Fortune 100 organizations had at least one compromised credential. So this is a problem that is pervasive, both in terms of the breaches that occur and also in terms of the organizations impacted. And then we've got a cost of a breach number here, 4.6 million, as the average cost of a breach using stolen credentials. Now, there can be a lot of debate about the cost of a breach numbers and how they're determined, but I think that it's hard to argue that breaches using stolen credentials for account takeover don't have a significant financial impact. It's pretty clear that they do. So it's clear that this is a topic that has it's pervasive and it has a significant impact on organizations. In order to understand more about account takeover and the use of stolen credentials, we want to start with why attackers care about these accounts. What is it that attackers are after in these scenarios when they're perpetrating these types of breaches and attacks? So obviously, there's value in data harvesting. If you can access accounts, you can gain access to personal and sensitive information. We'll talk about some examples on the next slide, actually. The use of credentials for credential stuffing itself is a key. It's an interesting cyclical approach, right? If you can get access to accounts by taking them over, you can get access to credentials that you can then use further for credential stuffing attacks down the road as well. Service disruption can certainly be an objective that attackers have as well. They can target small and large organizations there. And then finally, financial gain. And financial gain is actually really, in many ways, a roll-up of the others, because in most cases, attackers who are perpetrating an account takeover attack are interested in financial gain in one way or another. Either they're specifically targeting accounts that allow them to get data they can sell, or they may be targeting accounts that allow them to actually access money, or they might be being paid as an attacker to disrupt a service as well. But financial gain kind of sits as the foundation for why attackers care about account takeover and the accounts behind them, the accounts targeted. So there are a number of examples that have occurred in the market. We put them on a timeline here. this is certainly not comprehensive, right? We pulled out some highlights to talk about not just the theoretical reasons, but also the actual incidents that have occurred. So, back in at the end of 2022, beginning of 2023, we had an incident with PayPal. Everyone's probably familiar with PayPal, where 35,000 users were affected, personal data was exposed. Then a completely different type of organization, Hot Topic, so U.S. retail, they had actually multiple credential stuffing attacks that occurred over a period of months, from February to June in 2023. Um, and then 23andMe is one that's particularly interesting for a couple of reasons. So the first reason is just that it occurred over a long period of time and that it was a combination of techniques. So there was credential stuffing to access the initial accounts. But then once accessed, there's a feature in 23andMe called DNA relatives that allowed those attackers to scrape even more information from inside of the accounts. So it impacted a large number of users, but had this sort of secondary vector. And we'll talk about the second reason why 23andMe is important on the next slide. And then it seems like, from November through January, we just had, one incident a month that we pulled out. The North Face, as a US retailer, about 200,000 accounts compromised. Jason's Deli, another completely different kind of business, had a huge number, 340,000 customers' data exposed with credential stuffing. And then an Australian retailer called The Iconic had about 15,000 individuals compromised using credential stuffing as well. So it's interesting to me that all of these incidents specifically called out credential stuffing. So often with information in the news, we don't know exactly what the attack vector was, but in all of these cases, it was specifically identified as credential stuffing leading to account takeover. And I mentioned that 23andMe is worth a second look because it also resulted in this class action lawsuit. So that's a legal action that's been taken that hasn't been entirely resolved. So we don't know exactly what the result is going to be here, but it does indicate how expansive a problem and uniquely expansive a problem account takeover is. If you are the victim of as an organization of an account takeover attack, you may be liable for compromises that occurred elsewhere. So remember, with 23andMe, the compromise was that credentials were stolen or breached somewhere else and then used to log into 23andMe and do things that a valid account can do. And 23andMe actually has said, well, that's not really our fault because we're not in charge of those credentials. They were separate. And that's doesn't seem to be playing particularly well legally for them at this point. So there can be legal consequences for being a victim of credential stuffing, for not protecting against credential stuffing. And ultimately, that means you can have an incident when you don't have any known vulnerabilities. Of course, no organization has zero known vulnerabilities. But in this case, the credential stuffing, it's a valid login using credentials obtained somewhere else. And that makes ATO, account takeover attacks, sort of a uniquely expansive problem, as we mentioned. Now, there are multiple vectors for account takeover to take place, and I wanted to call all of them out here, even though we'll focus specifically on these compromised credentials as an example. But account takeover can stem from phishing, always popular. Phishing remains an effective tool for gathering account information. Account takeover can stem from leaked tokens. So if a token is leaked somewhere, there was an incident with Mercedes-Benz recently where an API token was posted in a public GitHub repository that provided access to their source code. That is a kind of account takeover. Session hijacking, if sessions are vulnerable, can result in account takeover. Of course, straight up broken authentication, which is one of the OWASP API top 10. If your authentication mechanism is broken, that can also result in account takeover. So, those are all vectors for account takeover, but compromised credentials, mass compromised credentials, is one that's particularly worth our attention because all of the other vectors, they require more action from the attacker and they tend to be smaller in scale, not 100% of the time. But when you have hundreds of thousands or millions of credentials that you can use, it lets you scale the attack in a particular way. The account takeover attacks using compromised credentials also have a larger pattern for us to talk about, or a larger process, because they do start with the process of credential collection. So when you're talking about account takeover, somewhere those credentials have to be gathered. They have to come from somewhere. And criminals are actively working to collect those credentials from organizations using whatever attack techniques and attack vectors they can to gather credentials. Once they've gathered them, they may then choose to sell them. So it's important to understand that there's an economy behind the breached credentials. In this case, you've got credentials that are essentially unverified in most cases. That means that the seller who has collected them doesn't know that they're valid credentials. It's just a database of credentials, and they can sell those for some money, but they can make them more valuable if they're verified or known to be valid. Now, of course, multiple parties might be involved here. So I might be an attacker who gathers a bunch of credentials, sells them. I might sell them to someone who then chooses to verify them in order to make them more valuable and sell them again. Maybe I don't sell them and verify them myself in order to sell them for a higher value. So there's a process here and an economy behind the credential collection. But these attackers or brokers, once they've verified credentials, they then, of course, want to sell them for a higher value because they are verified. And then generally, once you've got someone buying verified credentials, their intent at that point is pretty clear. They're interested in actually using those credentials for some kind of an attack, usually an account takeover attack. That's what credentials are good for. It's pretty rare that the attacker collecting the credentials is going to be the same one exploiting them at the other end of the process. It's possible, of course, but generally speaking, people are trying to make money along the way throughout the process. And that's why there's a kind of economy behind this process for compromised credentials. So we wanted to call that out specifically because it's a larger process. But in terms of mitigation, there are mitigation steps that can be taken for each of those vectors that I mentioned. Obviously, and we'll talk about some of the mitigation steps that we think are most important for the compromised credentials as well in a little bit more detail. But for phishing, for example, there are obviously anti-phishing technologies out there that exist. There is user training, always popular, training users not to click on bad links, has some effectiveness. You can use egress proxies as a phishing prevention mechanism as well in some cases. With leaked tokens, although generally a smaller volume of attacks, of account takeovers, often can have a higher impact. In this case, good token management and hygiene is key. We saw, recently with the Okta breach that, tokens were compromised. Organizations had to rotate their tokens, and that was an important part of their token management and hygiene. Of course, if you can do API leak detection, if you can actually search for compromised tokens or publicly shared tokens outside of your organization, you can then take more action to manage those tokens as well. For session hijacking, if you can implement strong session management, that's a key mitigation factor there. Around broken authentication, as I mentioned, this is one of the OWASP API top 10. Detecting those vulnerabilities through testing and vulnerability assessment is key. Blocking attacks in line is also an important layer of defense there. If you can detect the attacks targeting that broken authentication mechanism and block them, that's also important. And then finally, we get back to compromised credentials, where what we want to talk about here is essentially a kind of kill chain, and relate it back, those mechanisms for mitigation back to the process that we talked about. So if we bring that process up again, we've got credential collection, sale, verification, the second sale of verified credentials, and then finally that credential exploit. And it's important to label here which of these actions occurs inside and outside of your organization. So outside of your organization, that credential collection might occur. You're hoping, if it's someone else, you're hoping that they're stopping breaches with other controls that apply to their organization. Now, of course, just like with supply chain management, almost everyone is a supplier to someone. You could also be the victim of that credential harvesting, and you should protect yourself with a variety of security controls from any of the kinds of breaches that might actually collect credentials at that first step. At the credential sale standpoint, that first sale, There's certainly opportunity for law enforcement to help prosecute and prevent those kinds of sales. It's a difficult job, but possible. And then this is where an API leak detection tool can also help. If you can identify credentials that have leaked, that's valuable. You can then rotate those credentials or block them if possible, or force password resets in your application if possible. Another difficult job, but possible to implement some protections there. When you get to this process of credential verification, this is where you have an opportunity to interrupt the process effectively by implementing controls in your applications and in your infrastructure specifically. Because at this point, you have an attacker who is specifically trying to authenticate with the credentials. Here you can detect the usage of compromised credentials. You can certainly implement multi-factor authentication as a means to reduce the likelihood that compromised credentials can be used alone. You can also look for patterns of behavior, like someone trying to brute force, brute force detection. So someone repeatedly hitting the login function in your application. You can implement rate limiting. If you can implement rate limiting on specific API endpoints, as an example, that's a great way to reduce the likelihood of success and make it a little bit more expensive for someone verifying credentials. And then any behavioral detection you can do around API abuse is also valuable for identifying that this step is occurring and helping to prevent it as well. And then you have that verified credential sale. So you're back to some law enforcement, leak detection if possible, and then that last step of credential exploit. Now, the controls you're going to apply here are the same controls, but they may be effective in different ways. In this case, you're likely to see more targeted use of credentials. So detecting the usage is important. You may still catch things with brute force detection or rate limiting, but if they're using fewer credentials or if they're executing more low and slow attacks, it's going to be a little harder to detect them there as well. But that is where you can apply some detection capabilities for compromised credentials. So this brings us to, how do you actually respond to this? What do you do in order to address the challenges of account takeover attacks? So there are some open source options that you can employ for implementing some of those mitigation techniques. You've got things like API gateways for implementing rate limiting, for centralizing authentication. Totally possible to implement some capabilities there. Obviously, analyzing logs and blocking malicious sources can have known malicious sources can have a benefit as well. So tools like fail to ban and CrowdSec can help you do that. You can block bad user agents with tools like Nginx and mod security. And there are ways to implement device fingerprinting or connection fingerprinting as well that can help with mitigation as well. All right. So the challenge with those open source tools is that they tend to be point solutions. They can often implement, you can use them effectively for a specific task, but if you want to implement a comprehensive account takeover strategy, you need layered defenses. Tim, I think you were talking about the need for layered defenses at the start, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this will be a great walk of what those layers are, and then we'll get very specific, I think, in the next coming slides.
Yeah. So the challenge there is that is, where do you want to spend your effort? Do you want to spend your effort building and putting together tools that are available as open source tools, or do you want to spend your effort actually, actually defending yourself from those account takeover attacks?
Yeah.
And increasingly, yeah, go ahead, Tim. If you had
yeah, and I'm very much a builder. So those that know me know that I love to build and love to build and love to build, and so it's are you building the right things to bring value to your business and not just building to build where you could implement another source? And I think this was a big aha moment even throughout my career as I've been going on. It is, I've always loved to build. I've always loved to create because I've got a creator side in me. But at some point, you've got to look at what you're creating, and is it really helping you and your business getting the value that you need? And so sometimes what you're creating is great, but it may not be bringing a ton of value, and the return on investment isn't there. And so I think, like you're saying, not all bots are created equal. But also, when you're trying to put all these things together, as I've tried to do in the past, it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And so finding the right tool for you is actually really important, or the right tools, and then looking for those tools that you can combine together to not necessarily always have the ability or the need to create things. It just, for me, has been an aha moment throughout my career, from the beginning of it until now.
Well, and you can very easily take a collection of actually really interesting and valuable tools and make it a full-time job to build and maintain them, right? If you're a builder, if that's the nature of who you are, you can become very focused on that and quite happy building and maintaining those tools. But the point that I want to make about this slide, which I think is important, is that part of that requirement is that you then keep up with the threat environment. So the threats that you're trying to defend against today, if we talk about these sort of first generation of bots, they're pretty easy to detect and blacklist. They do, fairly repetitive attacks, but that threat environment doesn't stay static. And so you end up, if you put together a bunch of open source tools, you end up being challenged to manage, to keep up with that threat environment as the automation becomes more sophisticated, where you end up with bots that can rotate through a large number of different user agents as a means of obfuscating their behavior, that can obviously come from different IP addresses, an example, to obfuscate their behavior and evade some of those detection techniques.
Yeah, and it's been really hard, right? So if you look at the advent of cloud, and you get those nice little free tiers that you're not paying a lot of money for, it's great for us inventors and creators to use them and try different things. But on the flip side is it's also great for those that are trying to compromise environments to use them for nefarious purposes. So as the cloud has gotten more and more popular, it's really created a problem and a need to actually mitigate those bots in a much different way than we always used to, right? So as you talk about these first generation, those were relatively easy because they were coming from single IPs or single subnets, and those were easy to block. Well, when you're getting them from tens of thousands of IPs now, what are you doing, right? So we've had to get better in the way that we're actually blocking these bots.
Yeah, exactly. And the technology that they're targeting has changed as well. So, we've moved from a world where, the web application was king, was the leader, to a world where delivering services via APIs is really where we are today. And in fact, anything that's delivered today as a web application is ultimately backed by APIs. We like to say that web applications are just legacy APIs, but it's also that the newer web apps that are delivered are really just built on top of those APIs, and there's no reason for an attacker not to address the APIs directly. In fact, there's benefit for that attacker to ignore the web app in most cases because the APIs are easier to abuse, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you're talking about scrapers, the APIs were basically taking structured data and giving it to both your website or your HTML code, your JavaScript code, as well as the bad guys, the hackers that are trying to come in and get it. So you're making it easier for the front end folks to get data, and you're also making it easier for anyone else that wants to get the data. And so that's really the hard part in trying to figure out who is actually good and who is actually bad, and trying to understand the difference of those, and how do I make sure that the people that are coming in and trying to log in are actually consumers. And I think the idea of APIs is great, but they're also a little scary because we're putting that structured data right on the edge of our networks.
Yeah. I was talking to an analyst, and I can't. I'll paraphrase the quote at least because it was interesting and really resonated with me. We were talking about passwordless authentication, or we were talking about multi-factor authentication. No, passwordless. And the point that this analyst was making is that the implementation, the biggest, I can't remember how he phrased it exactly, but the problem with passwordless authentication is that the API for the password-based authentication still exists. So what he was seeing in the market is that people implement that security control aiming to remove passwords, but they have the fallback as an API, and that allows people to still authenticate with passwords. And that becomes one of these easy to abuse APIs for account takeover as well.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. It's as you try to be more secure, there's always, especially in an e-commerce or a retail world, how much friction do you really want to put in between your customers and them logging in and being able to buy, right? And as a past retailer, the answer to that is not a ton. I don't want to put friction into that buying experience, because I want to get that sell. That's how I'm selling now. And so the question becomes is what do we do? And that's, a lot of what the conversation is about today is what do we do and how do we stop the things that shouldn't be getting through to our APIs, especially on the login side.
Yeah, yeah. So let's just to put a point on this idea that APIs are easy to abuse. One of the key pieces here is that with an API, some of the mitigation tools that you would use with a web app simply don't work, right? You can't use JavaScript or CAPTCHAs to protect the API. They don't have that same model of interaction. And as you pointed out, Tim, APIs are ultimately designed to be consumed in an automated way. They're designed to deliver data. So if the method of if the goal of the attacker is to get at data in a programmatic way, the API is already built for that. And then finally, they're largely designed to be open. So APIs have a hard time, they don't have the application logic to distinguish between good and bad behavior the way that you might build into a web app. And so they need some additional help in order to identify abuse, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it's worthwhile to put all of this into a kind of maturity model. So if you're wondering, where do you fit? What do you need to do? How do you move from doing nothing to sort of operational excellence around defending against account takeovers? This is the maturity model that we've envisioned, and then ultimately is going to lead into a demo from Tim here as well. So, level 0, of course, is that you have nothing, no defenses. You're doing nothing in particular to protect yourself from account takeover attacks. There's certainly organizations at level 0. Most organizations are doing something somewhere, which brings us to level 1, right? Here, you would be doing basic rate limiting. You might be blocking specific geographies or specific data centers. You could block Tor exit nodes or proxies. I actually just saw on social media yesterday, I think someone talking about how much noise you can remove from your application by blocking whole geographies like China and Russia. If you don't do any business there, it blocks a whole lot of noise. So totally effective basic control, basic defense to put in place. But it's not perfect. So we want to talk about how do you move up in terms of maturity. At that level 2 is where you start talking about understanding what it is you're defending. So that's where something like API discovery comes in. The adage, you can't protect what you don't know about, is certainly true. You can try and you can implement some protection, but knowing what you're protecting gives you many more options, not only for active protection, but also for reducing risk, preventatively.
As well as
Yeah.
changing. So especially with API discovery, right? If you don't know what's changing, how do you prevent that? So all of a sudden I have an API that didn't have a login and username, and all of a sudden somebody put one in because they wanted to change the way the application works. If you don't see that changing happening of your sensitive data, how do you know, right? It's one thing to know I put something in and that's what I'm going to protect, but it's the change over time that you have to be constantly watching for. It's not static, right? Applications and our application developer friends are never static. They're always creating new. And how do you keep up with that ever-changing environment?
And constantly push to higher velocity, which means a higher rate of change in the production environment as well.
Yeah.
And to your point, Tim, that change isn't just is it a new endpoint? Is it, did an endpoint go away? Did a new endpoint show up? But it's also within those endpoints, is there a new parameter that exposes some kind of data that might be sensitive? Things like that are also key components of that API discovery piece.
And we talk about that a lot with customers is especially with third parties. So you have a contractual agreement to do this data and that data. Well, who's watching out that a fourth and fifth and sixth type of data isn't also going to them? And how is that actually underneath your contractual agreement now? It gets really, really interesting because that data isn't changing, and who's watching out between that contract and that sensitive data that's actually based in those APIs.
Yeah, I agree. So at this second level of maturity, we also have we've put brute force detection and triggers. Those are related to each other, but basically looking for basic patterns of activity in the API that indicate someone is doing something repeatedly, like repeatedly hitting a login page and getting 404s with invalid credentials, as an example. And also the ability to apply a virtual patch to block known leaked credentials or leaked tokens here. That would apply at this second level as well. And then when you get to the third level of maturity, you start to get to more advanced defenses, things like smart rate limiting. So let's distinguish between basic rate limiting and smart rate limiting. Tim, do you want to say a little bit about what the difference between those two might be?
Sure. I think, it depends on who you talk to, but if you think about it simplistically, basic rate limiting is rate limiting by an IP. You see an IP come in, it can only do so many certain requests per second over the site. And when you get into smart rate limiting, I'm only allowing 30 requests a second into this API, and then each session can only do 2 requests a minute into my login API. So smart rate limiting allows you to go much deeper into depth and to really tweak how many requests you want and what your key is for that request rate.
Yeah. Okay, so then we also have compromised password detection, and this is a specific capability to identify at the time of invocation, at the time of use, a compromised password, and whether or not it's being used. That's important for identifying things like a low and slow attack, or even for identifying a legitimate user who's using a compromised password well before any kind of actual credential stuffing attack occurs. You also have here, yeah, go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, and I think this one is really important because if you look at the 23andMe legal arguments that are going on, and I'm by no means a lawyer, but I actually love to watch what's going on and seeing how they're playing out. And with compromised passwords, even if somebody else compromised the password and they're using it on your site, the thought of that organization having to be held liable is just it's uncanny. I didn't leak it. It's not my password, but yet now I'm on the hook for it. So that's why that one's really interesting, and why we believe so much into this compromised password detection, that if I can help you help prevent users from using known compromised passwords, the better and safer your users will be, as well as your organization from a legal standpoint. Lawyers cost money, and the bigger the lawsuit, the more cost those are. And so you're actually saving tons of money if you can prevent getting into those kinds of legal defenses.
Yeah, absolutely. And then 2 more items here at the third level: API abuse prevention. So if you can implement behavior-based detection of API abuse, that can help defend against account takeover attacks. And then finally, API leak detection. So we mentioned the ability to block leaked credentials. You can do that on a one-off static basis, but if you can actually detect those credentials, leaked in public, you can then automate that process more effectively. Especially, API tokens that might be posted in public repositories, as an example, that can help with those kinds of account takeover attacks.
Absolutely.
So that's the maturity model that we're looking at. But we want to make that a little bit more real for folks. So we want to shift over to a demo here. So Mr. Ebers here can switch to a demo. Now, if you're on LinkedIn, and as we go through this demo, if you want us to follow up with you, just put the word API in a comment in LinkedIn, and we'll pull that out as a reason to follow up. All right, Tim, I'll hand it to you.
Okay, sounds good. So this will be unlike a usual demo. I'm not going to go through the full product. What I'm going to do is really attack that ATO defensive maturity model that Tim and the team put together, because I really like it. So I'm going to actually walk you up that maturity chain and then show you how that maturity chain works with our product, because we want you to be able to see what that could look like for you and your organization. So let's start out with basic rate limiting. So for us, we can do basic rate limiting. Spoiler alert, we also can do very smart based rate limiting, and we do it about the same way. So I'll show you how to do that in a rule. So you can put whatever URI you want. So let's say you want to do the full site. You can do a rule like this. You can choose rate limiting, and then you can actually choose how many requests per second you're doing, what your burst rate looks like, and then what kind of response code you want to send back, and if you actually want a bucket or a no bucket, depending on your burst. So lots of different things we can do here. And then the most basic type of rate limit would actually be just a remote adder. And then when we come back to talk about smart rate limiting, I'll give you the rest of the exciting stuff that we can do. So that's a basic rate limit rule when it comes to rate limiting. And then being able to block geos and data centers and Tors and proxies. This is something that's really exciting for us to do. And we've had this for a long time. One of the big reasons why I purchased this when I was at one of my companies is because of the ability to block all sorts of different types of things. And so we give our customers the ability to block different source types. You see proxies and different data centers, because as a retailer, right, Google Cloud is probably not going to be ordering things off of my website. Now you may have some backend services that you may have to worry about, but this gives us a good idea and a good way to block things that shouldn't be buying from us. And it allows you to uncover the IP. So is there possibly some business at risk there? Possibly. And that's why this is a basic level, right? So it's a good sledgehammer when you may need something a little bit smaller than a sledgehammer, but it's a good place to start. And then we can also do this by location, as Tim and I were talking about, and just define where you want to be able to get requests from, or the source IP from. And we have all the different countries on here, and you can choose which ones you want and which ones you don't want to allow to come into your application. And we can do this by application as well as overreaching across the whole site. So that's kind of layer one. So then we can get into layer two, and we'll start with API discovery because it's one of my favorite tools, and I talk about this a lot. I love our API discovery tool because I can very easily, quickly find where all of my sensitive data is. So let's say I want to know where all of my login credentials are. I can click on one button and get all of our different endpoints with all of the different credentials in them, and then take a look at them and go, okay, where exactly should I care about all of this? And so here's an OAuth token, and here's a login. So if we want to create a rule on this particular API, we can actually do this and create a rule, and lo and behold, we can create a rate limit. So if we want to set one very specifically on a rate limit on an API, we can. So when you talk about smart rate limiting, this is when we're getting into smart rate limiting. I'm trying, kind of pushing 2 and 3 together here just because they flow good. But this is where we can actually add very specific and rate limits on hosts as well as on APIs and the full path.
And Tim, you can be more specific about the characteristics of that. Yeah, you're about to click on it. I see you headed for it. The characteristics of that URI that you apply the rate limit to as well.
Sure. This URI is fully customizable. We can actually set any condition in the header. We can actually do this by application, by method, by protocol, by schema. So we've got lots of different ways that we can actually look to see what we want to do that rate limit on.
And that, to me at least, that's what makes it smart rate limiting, is the ability to really customize that rate limit to a specific use case that's occurring in your environment, as opposed to applying it, super broadly.
Yeah, and also I think, even more granular than that is, what is the key, right? Everybody typically does rate limiting by IP, but why? Why by IP? And so we can actually do this on anything in the query, in the header, or in the path, or in the JSON body. We can do it across any of those, depending on how you want and how you want the key of the rate limit to be. Most people will just use remote adder, but if you think about it, should I really do a remote adder? Should I do it based on session? Should I do it based on key? Maybe I only want to see, a certain key so many times at any single API, because doing so would be odd or unusual, which also comes into API abuse a little bit when you, especially on the smart side. Mm-hmm. And then we on stage 2, we can also do brute force. So if we go into trigger, create a trigger, we've got the ability to do brute forces. We can do this by application. We can narrow it by IP. So if you don't want some IPs regarded into the brute force, we can actually take those out. And different than the rate limit, these brute forces would then be added to the deny list or the gray list where we'd actually block the IPs. The rate limit will just stop the traffic until those buckets have been emptied out or enough time has elapsed, and then it would allow more people to come back in those particular ones. So these are a little different because we can add it for a particular amount of time on the brute force. So they're a little bit different, where rate limiting is much more fine grained at the per second level. And I would say brute force is again, you're putting these IPs on because they're doing things that you don't want them to for a longer period of time. Okay, and that was actually, so this was actually the trigger that we were talking about. These triggers are actually, we've got a number of different triggers we can use, but being able to trigger based on what people are doing is really important. And we've got a number of these in here, but due to time, I won't go through all of these. And then the big thing here is how do we stop? How do we stop the attacks once they're going? And we have the ability, because we usually sit in line, which is one of the big reasons why we like to sit in line, is to be able to stop these folks. All right, it's one thing to see the traffic. It's another thing to stop the traffic. And so we spend a lot of time talking and working with customers on how do you want to stop the traffic, right? Especially in an out-of-band model, which we have. What you're saying is if the attacks come in, it's okay that they come in. We're just going to watch them and then look at them later. We believe that stopping them up front is really important. And so we have the ability to actually have a virtual patch. And adding this virtual patch, we can do a number of things with this, but we can create regexes with this. We can create a number of different things with the virtual patch that will block traffic. So we use this a lot with API tokens. So if there's a token that you don't want to see anymore on your site because it's been put out in the public, even though it might not be valid anymore, but you just want to block it to make sure, we would use a virtual patch to do that. I think that's everything at layer 2. So then we'll get into the smart stuff at layer 3. So layer 3 is really interesting. And we've talked a lot about smart rate limiting, so I won't go over that again. But really, smart rate limiting is something that you should really think about, especially in line. We're thinking about it a lot, and there's some cool new things that we're thinking about doing with it to make it more smart. But smart rate limiting is really a great thing to start with. And then I think we're going to keep compromised password detection for the last. So let's talk about API abuse. So API abuse is really where the machine learning comes in, and the ability to tell if the behaviors you're seeing are good or bad. So these lend well to bots that are doing things that are unusual compared to everyone else. So these are, I call these outlier bots, right? Typically API abuse is outliers, and what you're doing is looking for outliers with the rest of the environment. And so with our product, you can see the number of detectors, the high level detectors that we have. You can see the number of IPs that are in these different detectors. And then we can click through and actually see more information about these particular IPs and throw this over into our event viewer. And then we give you a lot of different information about these different bots, how these bots are compared to all of the other bots, the behavior of these bots, the performance of the bots, and the errors of the bots. So for us, looking at how many logins you're doing per session, how many logins or how many profile settings, say, you're doing. So if you're looking at adjacencies, if I'm clicking on my profile 100 times versus a normal user is doing it 2 times a session, we'll know that difference and actually raise that as an attack or as an API abuse bot. And then we have different types, and you'll see those in here as well as the detectors. Did I miss anything on API abuse, Tim? I feel like I have.
Well, I always like to point out the information about at the bottom of the top 5 status codes, top 5 methods, top 5 URL templates, because it gives you a high level view of what this particular bot has been doing and how the application has been responding. And that can be interesting information to see, that the bot has been hitting those particular URLs. The first one there you can see is off. at 82, which you would assume is a authentication in this case. And that's interesting information to have about the bot and what it's targeting.
Yeah, and especially when you look at the bot and the fact that it's getting all of these different types of response codes, typically a user with a web page in front of you or even a mobile app isn't going to get 403s, usually depending on the application, or 500s. 500s would be bad. So seeing that there's so many of the different types of requests and it's their top 5 out of the total number of requests seems a little odd to me.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's the kind of conclusion that you can draw with that information.
Yeah. And then API leaks. API leaks is an interesting part of our product. This actually is looking at different sources around the interwebs and looking for different types of credentials that we may see that are pointing back at your website. So you configure your domains, and then after you configure your domains, we have a very large database of basically fire hoses from 26 different sources, and we're looking at whether or not we can find credentials that are leaked about you and your digital surface. And so there's all sorts of different types here. We've got APIs, we've got MySQL dump files, Git credentials, and then we've also have some GitHub, or we did, maybe we fixed those. So you can see that some of these are closed because they were fixed. Here's some Git credentials. We actually tell you, what we're seeing, where we saw it, and then how to actually go and gather that so that you can see it for yourself. And then some of the types we can actually remediate with virtual patches, and so you can do that through here as well. And then I think the last but not least, and actually I would say last and the most fun, is credential stuffing. Credential stuffing is the product that we brought out about a month ago that I was super excited about. And it's really around one of the biggest problems that you have is when you get into a low and slow attack, where you've got a very patient bad actor that is, very slowly trying to see if credentials work on your website. And so our response to that, and it's really hard to pick up through machine learning because it's not happening very often. And so your window space has to be, days and not hours and not minutes. And so that's a lot of data that you have to keep track of and run through, which can be very hard depending on the type of model. And so what we've done is attack that a little bit differently, which is we're going to look at the passwords that are coming through our system and tell you if those passwords have been compromised or not. So we've got a database of more than 1 billion passwords that have been compromised, and we're going to compare those to the passwords that we see coming through. And so where we've tied our product together is we've got recommendations coming in from API discovery. We can apply those recommendations to where we have both the login and the password. This is what it looks like when it's put all together. You've got your location for your password and your location for your login. And then we give you a number of things that we can do with this. One of them is you can download a CSV, and this will have both when it happened, the username, as well as the response code. So you'll know if they were successful or if the request was successful or not. Or you can actually take these and look at these in the event viewer. And so what you get here is a list of usernames, and then we've obfuscated the passwords. And so all you get is the JSON payload, as well as the password, but you'll never see anything in it because we've obfuscated it. And so here you can see the full request, where it's coming from, where it was going, content type, and everything you may want to know about that request. And then that's really cool so that you can go and see it as a security folk. But so now as a security person, you've got two options. I can either pull all this down through a CSV, and then what do I do? And so we needed to think differently about how we deal with this one, because what our ultimate goal would be is for you to actually make sure that these usernames are getting forced to reset a password. We don't necessarily want to block the request, but because that may break the business logic that you have. So what we've done is we've created a trigger, again with our triggers, and we can, based on a compromised user account, do a number of different things. So for instance, if there was a compromised user account and the status code was, say, a 200, what we can do is actually add a webhook. Now you can set up a webhook on your side to take this information in. We could create some authentication mechanism between us, and then we can actually drive on the back end, maybe a reset password business operational email out to the customer. And then you and your business are allowed or have the ability to be able to send it out like you and your business would want, rather than us just, stopping and blocking it, because we just feel like that's very clunky to the business. And so here's a way that you can actually, from a security standpoint, say, hey, we can be more secure and we're not going to break your business. And so we're really excited about how this works all together.
So just to put a finer point on that, because I think it's important, we're talking about credential stuffing, which means we're talking about credential stuffing attacks. But the way that this capability works, we're really matching known compromised passwords against those being used in the application.
Sure.
And that means that most of those attempts are probably going to be a legitimate user who has a compromised password before that credential stuffing is carried out by an attacker. And so if you can implement this in a way that resets their password, you can effectively prevent the credential stuffing attack that might come from being successful because you've removed the compromised password from that account before it's been used as part of an attack.
Yeah, and that's a really great point, Tim. The bottom line is you can't control the passwords that your users have put in. You can change a little bit of the complexity in what you want to do, but again, there's friction. If you've got a requirement for a 16-character long password, right? Who can remember that? And so there again is friction. And so what we've done is we've tried to take that friction out, right? If the password is compromised, I'm going to tell the customer that put it in that it's compromised and force them to change their password to something that hasn't been compromised. And it may surprise them that it's been compromised, but I think that surprise of compromise is really you looking out for your customer. Hey, I know that this password's been compromised that you used on our website. Could you please change it? Because we prefer you not to use one that's been compromised.
It's a very polite way of saying it. We prefer you not to use one that's been compromised.
Well, because then you've got some legal grounds to back. And again, I'm not a lawyer, but in my simplicity, it's, hey, we tried. We told them that it was compromised. I don't know what else I can do except for them just not allow them to use it and force them to change it, which you now have the ability to do. It actually puts a lot of things in play here, which is really, really nice.
Yeah, exactly.
That was a lot. I think that was it. I think that's all of them.
I think we went through all those levels in the maturity model, didn't we?
Yeah, I think we did.
That's
except
awesome.
for the no defenses one. So here's the no defenses. This is the no defenses demo. There
you go.
There's the no defenses demo.
That's perfect. All right. So just to wrap up, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A or in the comments in LinkedIn. We'll see if we can get to them. While people do that, or while I look for questions, I will put up the next webinar that we have planned. You may or may not know that NIST released their cybersecurity framework version 2.0 recently, last week, I think it was. So we're planning a webinar to talk about the NIST CSF 2.0 and the NIST CSF dashboard that we've added to the product. That'll be April 3rd is when we're planning that webinar. So, we'd love for you to attend. Let me take a look and see if we've got any questions that we want to answer here.
There is one.
Yes.
Did you see that one? So
yeah. You want to answer that one, Tim, or shall I?
Well, let me ask it and you can answer it. So did we have an increase or decrease in attacks in 2023?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, WallArm does a API threat stats report. We just completed our annual version of that for 2024, looking back at 2023. The last webinar we did was all about the one prior to that was all about the API threat stats report. The short answer is yes, we saw an increase in attacks. But the more interesting statistic out of that report that I found really important was the balance between attacks that were targeting web applications and those that were targeting APIs. So I'll see if I can remember the numbers specifically. We saw in 2022, it was, I think, 54% of the malicious traffic we saw, malicious attacks, was targeting APIs. And so the remainder was targeting web applications. In 2023, that jumped up to 70%. So we're seeing a dramatic increase in attackers targeting APIs over web applications, which follows with the increase in the use of APIs as opposed to web applications for service delivery as well. But if you're interested in a whole bunch more detail about the threat environment and API attacks, there's a whole threat stats report that you can get from the WallArm website, or you can go back and look at the webinar and watch us present that material as well.
Yeah, and I think it's only going to get higher. I think it's always going to be increasing year to year because things aren't slowing down, right?
Yeah.
I think just attacks in general, especially with the SEC rules of forcing public companies to actually be much more visible in what's going on in the organizations. I think we're going to actually get a huge uptick that we weren't expecting here in 23 and 24 as those kick in.
Yeah. There's one more question I see in here. Let me see if I can get back to it. It was how many account takeover attacks can be attributed to VBA macros? Interesting question. I don't have a direct answer for that. I mean, that would be part of, generally speaking, I would think of that as part of the phishing space, because most likely those are going to be delivered as via phishing, but I don't think we have specific data about how many attacks can be credited to VBA macros.
No, I mean, at some point, VBA macros become almost a Trojan that you're sending in or virusy. And I don't think we get down to that detail in the products that we have.
Yeah. All right. I'm just scrolling through. I don't see any additional questions from folks. So I'd love to say thank you for spending time with us. Feel free to attend the next webinar. If you'd like us to follow up with you, you can just put the words API in a comment on LinkedIn, and we will find you and follow up. But otherwise, thanks, Tim, for the amazing demo and all the commentary throughout the presentation as well.
Yeah, and thank you, Tim, for being such a great partner. This has been a fun little presentation, as we always have when we do these together.
It is. It's always fun. Excellent. Thanks, everyone.